Sorry, like you said, sorry. So welcome along. We've done a few intros in the room. My name's Rachele. I'm one of the founders of Flourish Together. We've been supporting people to create social change for a long time. We reinvest our profits in supporting women for support of social change, and we've decided to work smarter this year, haven't we, Shelley, through through some backing from the Business Growth Hub and Manchester City Council in that West. We're supporting lots of different people between now and next March. I think we're supporting in the region of sort of 50 to 60 people who we've pretty much already found. You know, it's one of those, we've got quite a large network of change makers we've been supporting for over 8 years, and they're looking at developing knowledge and skills in all sorts of areas. We've done lots of programs to help with called our Time to Grow program and our early program, helping people feel their knowledge and skills in starting well when they've got an idea for social change and figuring out what they want to do and how it might work, and growing and developing their ideas, or growing and developing a social enterprise, charity, campaigns, you name it, people across the spectrum of people that we support. And this year we're running something called Flourishing Mondays. So we're back after the summer running one today. We've also, so the Flourishing Mondays are here every other week at the Resonance Centre. There's a bit like this today, very like this. The mornings kind of couple of hours topic and a bit of a theme. And then the afternoons all about discussing either that theme or other things. They're a work out of home day, in effect. We found after the pandemic, people were wanting to get back in a room, but also have this kind of hybrid approach, which is why we've got our Pass the Parcel talk this morning on Zoom. And having attended a lot of workshops, you know, the people that we've worked with for the last couple of years and through the pandemic, about 140, 150 people we've helped to set up a social business in the last couple of years in spite of the pandemic. They really want the time to kind of think, implement a lot of the tools and tips and things that we've been working on, and keep connecting, you know, remotely or in a room. So that's why we're running these events. We've also been running them in Stockport. We've just started a Flourishing Friday. For anyone who doesn't know, that's once a month. That's out of the Village Web Company, which is a little hub in Romilly Precinct. And we ran our first one last week, all about income generation. There'll be a follow-up webinar on that people can get hold of, which again, a bit of a panel talk, discussions on all sorts of things in the afternoon, very sort of peer workshop led, and then one-to-ones that people can book in for. So today's a very similar format, but we're thrilled to have the topic. I won't take Shelley's thunder away, she's going to introduce this for me. But the topic today is all about community assets, and how do you develop community assets, and how do you involve the community, how do you get your ideas together, and where do you find the money, these sorts of things. And we've got a real interest in this because we've, and Aya's here in the room from GMCVO, who's part of the partnership. We were successful with a bid for taking on one of the action stations. Action stations is an initiative with Transport for Greater Manchester, Network Rail, Northern Rail, who manage a lot of the train stations around. You'll have noticed if you use them that often they're derelict, some of them, or they're underused, and ticket offices are closing and all this stuff. So there were 4 stations up for grabs. Our bid for Heaton Chapel, we're working with Sarah Spanton and Nikki Dickens on a concept for what we'll do there. That won, she says. I think there were several bids, and so we've got a vested interest. We are physically, we've done the business plan, we're doing stakeholder engagement work, we are taking this thing on as a social enterprise hub, and you know, been raising bits of feasibility money, and we can perhaps feed into the mix depending on what the conversations are and how we've gone about what we've done. But that's happening for us, and then we've been offered to take on broadband station, because the people who were looking at that, which is a much bigger beast, much actually more what we need. And I've been speaking with Rachel, who's here on the panel, about some partnership work around that. So yeah, we're here to learn lots today, as well as share what we can, and excited to see what the conversation leads us to. So Shelley, can I hand over to you to say a bit about what you're doing and introduce our panel? Thanks.
So good morning, I'm Shelley. I think I've met most of you before, but not everyone. So I work with Rachele at Flourish. I'm the Programme Development and Support Manager, which means I do a bit of everything, really, helping Rachele.
Right arm, I think,
yeah, I'll have that. So yeah, today it's brilliant. We've got a fantastic panel here. We've got a really rich mix of people with different expertise in the topic. So we're looking at finance, assets, community buildings and spaces. So it's a huge topic, and it seems to be one that's really relevant at the moment. We've had a lot of interest. And people come at this from different perspectives. So sometimes it's very much commercially driven or entrepreneurially driven. You know, there's a need to generate some income for a business or an organisation. But often in our network, we find it's more socially driven. So people are doing it because they've spotted a need. So either they need to be able to reach their community or more of their community, or sometimes there's a specific asset or space that could do with saving or being put to community use. Or repurposing in some way to make it more beneficial for people in the local area. So I'm joined today, first of all on my left, we have Juanita, who's the founder of the Resonance Centre, where we are right now. Now in a second, I'm going to hand over to everyone and just ask you to introduce yourself and talk to us a little bit about what your specific interest in this topic is. But I'll just do a very quick introduction. On my right, I have Petra Morris from Stretford Public Hall and Co-operatives UK. Then we have Tom Dixon, who's an expert in asset transfer and also government advisor on the topic. We have Rachele Everoa from the Old Abbey Taphouse, and I found out today the names of CIC, so Steams, Pubs and Hubs, or is it Hubs and Pubs? Hubs and Pubs CIC. And then we have Sarah Spanton, who's advisor and consultant on waymarking and community development. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Juanita first. So Juanita, can you just tell us a bit about your interest in this topic and experience?
Oh, we've got Gurj as well tucked away there.
Oh, I'm good, sorry.
It's a funny angle, isn't it? There we go.
We'll
That's
come to Gurj
later. So I suppose, I mean, where do I stand? Well, I'll introduce myself first of all. So hello, my name is Juanita Margerison. I am indeed one of the co-directors of the Resonance Centre. Obviously we're a holistic wellbeing hub, but the building itself, I suppose really it's sort of slightly different from our point of view, because the building itself was mine originally.
And we've invited you totally on purpose from the perspective of somebody who owned the building and
has repurposed. I think, to be honest, at the time, I was very much driven by passion, altruism and need for something to change within healthcare. I think I definitely have taken a lot of risks that I was unaware of at the time, and thank goodness, because if you'd have had the whole picture, it may have just been too much and you wouldn't have had the guts to do it. So I think actually I've kind of discovered things in bite-sized portions as I've gone along and thought, okay, I might need to address that.
What was this before it was the Resonance Centre?
This was a kitchen and bedroom showroom for 30 years before it was the Resonance Centre. I took it over. I was Silver Spoon Kitchens and Bedrooms for many years. I was in interiors and was very hot-headed. I was very acquisition-based. My whole life was in that vein, really. I took it over about 2012, 2013. And by about 2016, my life had changed completely. My life had become more about yoga and plant-based eating than it had about, I don't know, washing machines and draining boards. And as much as I did very much enjoy the design and the creation elements of, interiors, it did feel very much, once I qualified as a yoga teacher, that I was so much better placed to help people with something a little deeper than just sort of, here's some shiny new worktops, that'll make you happy for 5 minutes, that kind of thing. So it became very important for me to repurpose the building. And I think really we were very much aided by lockdown, because we were able to start. I suddenly realized that lockdown had put all companies, all CICs, all businesses in the same boat, really, which is that nobody could deliver anything physical. So in the real world, our building wasn't finished. We were 20 to 30,000 pounds away from having it finished, with no view of where that was coming from. We weren't incorporated as a CIC, but we went into lockdown. So I knew we could just start delivering an hour a day online. So that's what we did. When funders asked how we were able to do that, we didn't really realize that there was supposed to be funding. We didn't know there was funding available for that kind of work. So we said, well, we were doing it because it just needed doing. And that then prompted some funding to come in our direction. And then we've kind of just built on it and grown from there. But we were speaking the other day, weren't we, that the Resonance Centre is in a slightly unusual position for a CIC that's only just over 2 years old, because it kind of had the asset in the beginning, if you like. But then at the same time, that has now presented us with certain challenges of like, gosh, this is much bigger than we thought it was, and it needs managing, and it needs an infrastructure, and yeah. So
Shelley's no doubt got loads of other questions for you shortly, but at
Yeah,
least
go
it's
on.
given a little flavour of what you've got here and how it got started.
yeah,
That's great. Yeah, that's it
Thanks,
from Petra.
Petra.
yeah, no problem at all. There we go.
Petra, hi.
Good morning, everyone. I'm talking to the screen and everyone here in the room, so it's slightly odd. So I'm Petra Morris. I'm wearing two hats today. I work for an organisation in Manchester called Co-operatives UK. We're a national infrastructure body, and we represent and are the voice of the thousands of cooperatives across the UK. Cooperatives come in all shapes and sizes. They're not just your local convenience store. We have cooperatives in food and farming and community hubs and taxis and pubs and all sorts. So they operate all sizes, all sectors, and they're all very different. But what knits them together is that they usually try to do things in their communities, and they are owned by their members, who can be the workers, the community. My role at Co-operatives UK, I'm really lucky. I work on a programme called The Hive. It's a business support programme for new cooperatives. It's funded by the Cooperative Bank, one of our members. And for the last 6 years, I don't know how many cooperatives we've supported, both new and existing. So I'm really lucky to have that background. But when I'm not at Co-operatives UK, supporting new cooperatives and existing cooperatives, I'm also a volunteer director at my own cooperative just outside of Manchester. Is a beautiful Grade 2 listed building called Stretford Public Hall.
Throw in a pitch.
Yeah.
We're going to have a Christmas event there, and we'll tell you more about, because we want people to see the space. It's fantastic.
It is fantastic. So I'm really lucky to be a volunteer director. It's an unusual venue in that it's listed. It's a what we call a charitable community benefit society. So you may come across quite often the term of community benefit society, which essentially means just that. It's a asset or service or co-op that's there for the benefit of its local community. And we were really lucky. I'm not one of the founder members, but back in 2015, when the council who owned the building and were using it as offices were going to sell it, the community basically came together and said, we can't lose this wonderful building and just have it turned into accommodation or offices. And so we were lucky to do an asset transfer from the council. We went on to raise initially £250,000 from the local community, from the members, through something called community share offer, which hopefully I can say a little bit more about. And we now have a staff team, we have a board of directors, and there's a wonderful refurbished ballroom, and we do wellbeing events and music events. There's shared office space, there's an art studio, and we also do lots of things in the community through our funded work. So it's a real privilege to work. Not everyone's going to be taking on a listed building of that size, I imagine, but in terms of how we got there and the story, hopefully I can share a little bit more of that this morning, and also the hundreds of other communities around the country that have also taken on their services and their assets by being a cooperative. Is that helpful? I'll pass on to Tom.
Thank you very much.
Or do you want me to?
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Or just this slightly. There we go. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Glad I just shared this morning. Morning, everyone. So my name is Tom Hickson. I'm an independent social entrepreneur that specialises in community asset transfer. I've been lucky enough to be on what I would determine as both sides of the fence as such. So back in 2011, 2012, when local government authorities had the big issue around having to relinquish specific budgets, one of the particular areas that they were looking at is how they relinquish assets in the form of community asset transfer. So it was very new to local authorities around this particular time, and we were in the middle of a global economic crash at the same time. So one of my particular roles was to look at developing policy for asset transfer with local authorities and enabling them to understand what it actually meant to actually undertake a community asset transfer, not just from a communication and legislative perspective, but also from the perspective of the business planning, the governance structuring, the financial implications that goes into it. In addition to that, I then worked on the community and voluntary sector side of it, which was then looking at how we bring together organisations that were ready to take on particular assets. So we undertook 2 particular phases of work, one of which was known as pre-feasibility, which was a particular government fund that was funded by the Department of Housing and Communities at the time. And it was to look at whether organisations were actually ready. So being able to go through that business planning compliance and to look at then how they would tender in a particular competitive environment around community asset transfer. Since then, obviously, it's expanded dramatically. Local authorities have obviously now got to a point where they've expanded dramatically, not just from a community facility perspective, but into land acquisition as well, which was something that wasn't really at the infancy of community asset transfer when it first started. So again, my role was to understand how that legislation could work from the perspective of securing leases in the form of community asset transfer, and combining that with looking at the legalities around leasehold versus freehold. So that was a really interesting step change in terms of the way in which community asset transfer has certainly evolved over time. Now, obviously, we're in a situation, as we've discussed informally already, where assets are running out, and there is an issue on both particular sides of the fence. From the local authority perspective, it's a skill gap to an extent where the people within corporate properties or housing or specific areas of the directorates of the local authority are not sure legally how they can manifest new assets to come on to become community assets of value. And then by the same token, you have obviously a huge thriving sector within the voluntary sector, social enterprises, community interest companies, etc., that are trying to acquire assets. So my role in that particular sense is to try to broker that particular aspect, to look at how local authorities can make that acquisition from a legal perspective, understand what assets they can transfer and what they can't, and then from a community perspective, ensuring that organisations are actually ready to take it on. It's really important. For me personally, it's something that I've worked on, gosh, for over 20 years, but since the buzzword community asset transfer came out, probably the last 10 years in terms of this particular work. So obviously for me today, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd be delighted to share further experiences on community asset transfers that I've directly been involved with, the successes, the pitfalls, the learning curves that come with it, because when you're going into this for the very first time, it's not easy. And to navigate your way through it, especially when you're working with a local authority that's also pretty new to it, it makes it very, very difficult. But there are people like myself, and there are many other networks across Manchester and Greater Manchester, also Lancashire and Cumbria and other neighbouring counties, where people do support this particular area of work, because as mentioned, when you're heading into the very first time, it's important to have that real core support to understand whether you can do it or not.
If it's right, I remember going to a Mac workshop. They're pretty good at running these workshops, and I realised straight away it wasn't going to work for us, and that actually a Juanita or a Rachel style was going to work. But I know lots of community organisations that interested in transfer island is the only option, or the best option.
Absolutely, and it's having that ability to look at the current market view of what assets are available and whether it's the right type of asset, and then within that, obviously, there is then that element to need to look at revenue stream building immediately from the get-go, unless there is a particular element of capital funding or revenue funding that can support you for a period of time. So enabling those revenue streams to actually be embedded from the offset, again, is another challenge that obviously we've seen over the years. There has been some real successes where you can combine different revenue streams from the community asset that enable the success to happen, but you have to have those networks in place before you can go ahead and do that, obviously.
Does it take?
Completely depends. So if you have a local authority that understands the landscape, you have a building that is right for you, within a 6 to 8 month period, you could go through what we would determine as pre-feasibility, which is getting the business plan into a shape where you can make a decision on whether the asset's right for you or not, and then go for the legal process of that. But that is completely dependent upon the pace in which the local authority move at, because they obviously will have to get it through senior cabinet officials to hand over that particular asset, even if it's just a leasehold. And I say just from the perspective that it would be a long-term lease arrangement, which typically local authorities now would look at minimum 25-year leasehold. In some cases, there are freehold acquisitions, but most of all, local authorities do try to keep hold of the asset itself. And then obviously under community asset transfer, it's a case of negotiating the best peppercorn rate, meaning the lowest possible community-based rate of lease rate that you would pay per annum. Now, in some cases, it's a small number of pounds per annum. I've seen community asset transfers where it's been less than £10 per year, for example, for a really good building. But it depends again on the local authority, because what a lot of people forget is with a community asset transfer, you're doing the local authority a huge favour, and it's never presented that to you, because the fact is you're taking a number of utility bills off the books, you're taking a number of tax efficiency, a number of other costs that are known to a particular asset away from the local authority so that they can make budgetary savings. Okay, and ultimately that is something that needs to be reconciled from the offset when negotiating the type of asset transfer that is right for you.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, really, really interesting. Rachel.
Hiya. So I've always been a barmaid, and my mum's a single mum, so from the age of 14 I had to go and do all different types of jobs. And when I was 21, I got the opportunity to open my first bar. It was a disaster. What people don't realise is lots of pubs and bars back, I'm 35 now, 15, 20 years ago, were run by gangs, and there's lots of money laundering. So I had this really weird experience in my early 20s of getting involved in lots of venues, and then behind the scenes there was other things going on. So every time I built up a community and the more attention I brought to these venues, the more I was actually upsetting someone. And then at 23, I decided to go to uni, and I found out about social enterprises. So whilst I was at uni, I started volunteering at a place called Platt Chapel. And same again, there was a gangster behind it. We got thrown out, but we had a social enterprise then. It was really good, and it kind of planted a seed in me. And then throughout uni, I realised I kind of wanted to get into the art charity sector. So I volunteered, I tried to get so much experience. And when I left uni, I applied for all these jobs and no one would take me on. And it's quite a weird little world, the art charity and community development and it was really hard I couldn't get into it. So what I started doing is doing my own projects and doing bar work on the side. So I met Craig and we launched our community events company, and we started putting on big 500 capacity events around Manchester, and we'd purposely find unusual spaces that were struggling and put on these events. And the oldest person we had coming was 70 and the youngest was 18, and put on loads of live music. We built up a following that way. And then in it, Craig was doing academia at the university, and I had this thing about going around venues and helping owners with events and bookings and bringing more people in. And one of the places we found was the Old Abbey Taphouse. An owner only opened it for lunches, and it was right on the doorstep of the uni. So I ended up going there and working for him for a bit and putting on events. And then the lease came up for it, and our band room had been upstairs there. And I'm a feminist, but lots of people underestimate me. So this pub owner, play the Dappy card, it really works in your favour, ladies. So he was trying to palm us off his lease, which we were 40 grand in debt with. And I kind of picked up really quickly he was trying to do this. So me and Craig went along with it, but kind of so we fostered a meeting with the director of the science park. And then what I do is read everyone's strategies and basically write what they want to hear. So then we went in with this business plan, and we'd gone on an approach to university. We'd done loads of work with the residents over the 5 years we were there. And we wrote this amazing business plan, and we got a meeting in with the director of the science park. And I did batch my notes of it. And then we pitched it to him. And then it hit all his aims. So then we had to wait 4 months, but then he offered us a pub at peppercorn rent. for 6 months, but they get left an apprentice in charge of the lease. So she didn't put down what our rent actually was. So when we re-signed the lease, I didn't mention this to them, and then they got stuck with our public on rent. So yeah, so it's been a really interesting journey. We've almost gone bankrupt about 4 times a year. Bruntwood hate me. They tried to get us evicted. They did this whole campaign against me where they said I was violent and a drug addict. And I'm none of those things. The council made me a community leader at the same time they're doing that. So I've had to fight a lot of things. It's really tiring. Like if I knew, and I say this now, I'm 35, I don't have the energy to do it again. And if I knew what I knew now, the only person I'd tell to open a pub is my worst enemy. Like, go and open a pub. But I'm really grateful for the community, and what I care the most about is the community around me, and I don't give a shit about developers or money or funders. And now I have quite good relationships and I've got funding and awards, but it took 4 years to prove that who I was working with. And I really like have a lot of admiration for you and what you're doing too. There seems to be 2 worlds. There's what we do is, obviously I'm a community activist, what I do on the ground working with actual communities, and then the layer above, the funders and community developers who don't really understand what it's like working in communities. And so I got training in direct democracy last week. It's a really good funder, but I was trying to point out that I'm now meant to be a psychologist, a social worker, a landlady of a pub, a business, like an accountant, and it's all put on me. And there's a whole industry around the work I do. So people training, people helping me do funding bids, people consulting, but not any money for the work I actually do, like electricity bills, transport, staff. So there needs to be, we need to start thinking about this as an industry. And then also, if I ever bring up things, people tell me I need to put in boundaries, but because we're open 7 days a week, if I turn up at the pub at 11 and someone turns up and tells me they're suicidal at 10 past 11, I can't be like, I'm putting a boundary in. People are in crisis, and it's got worse now. It's got even worse with lockdown. We started doing 70 families every week. We're seeing more need. It's working families. I don't know what's going to happen with electricity. And I don't think we need any more tools, or, do you know what I mean? And we actually need direct action to sort this out. Like, I don't know what is going to happen. Sorry, I've gone on a run.
It's so important to get different perspectives on the panel, and as part of today as well, thinking about systems change, you know, thinking about systems change. We can't change them overnight, but we're having the right people in the room who can think these things through.
My last point though is also the work we do, like I have to be really careful because I don't want to gentrify the area. People are getting pushed out of Hume already. If I get involved in a community garden, am I pushing out the community that I've made the area nice for? And that's something I have to really think about. I can't afford to live in Hume now. And it's weird. It's like we're the people that make our communities great, but we don't get any of the value back from it.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work supporting Leamington Market, and that's a topic that's come up.
Yeah, there's loads of tension in Leamington.
So quick introduction to me. My original background was in the arts. I was based in Yorkshire, and for 27 years I've purely worked in the arts, but a lot of that work was community orientated. And I became very interested in how did all these blocks of flats that were getting kind of built around 2008, 9, 10, how are they happening? And who was making the decisions about that? And what did the local people think? These were the kind of key questions that were sort of really like, I didn't understand any of it. So eventually I decided to retrain in urban regeneration and development, and I moved over to Manchester and found the answers to those questions and learned how developers acquire land and how much they pay for land, and then how much it costs them to build and how they make their profits. I kind of understood all of that. But on that course, I also learned about social enterprise and in the module local economic development, and sort of started to sort of join the dots on how social enterprise, independent businesses and community businesses, how sort of key they are actually to sort of shifting how we do things in this country and in the world in general. And I tend to include co-ops in my very wide definition of what a social enterprise is. So I set up Waymarking, and we support local communities to lead on regeneration where they live and work. And I use the term regeneration to not mean gentrification. That's not what I mean. All these words, they get kind of corrupted, don't they, as they become trendy. I help community groups, community organisations, community businesses, but I tend to not work with individuals. It's more kind of groups of people coming together. It tends to be place-based work, which is just, it tends to be more that people are based in a place and they come to me to work with them, rather than maybe some of your situations where you're looking for a building and because buildings are hard to get hold of, you're having to find, you might have to move your neighbourhood that you really wanted to be based in, which is like obviously really tricky for you. So it's about helping people shape and influence how their neighbourhood's developing in a positive way, but also how those little parades of shops or a small town centre, you know, how that can develop positively. The work includes consultancy, it includes training and mentoring, it includes research, it includes actually delivering projects. And just to give a couple of examples of things I've done recently. So a couple of years ago, I was working with St Cuthbert's Church in Miles Platting, and they're very interested in how can they repurpose their church and the quite small bit of land around, how can they repurpose it as a community facility, maybe with housing, but also keep some sort of faith building. And how do they work with the local community to do that? And I did some research for them to support the initial, a little bit what, like you were saying, Rachel, where you read all the people's strategies and you work out what it is that, how can you deliver for them? How can you tick their boxes? Which I think you will do. Just you will do it, but it's a case of, you know, yeah, working out what it is you need to say. And then more recently, I've been working in Woodhouse Park in Manchester, and setting up a community-led research team who are going out and doing their own research into, and we're framing it in terms of making your neighbourhood healthier, but we, I think it links to what you were saying. Health can be understood in a very holistic sort of way. So children should be able to cycle. There should be a safe bike track. There should be some training. There should be a place for parents to come and to eat some nice food together and do family things. I would call all of that about health. So when I talk about health, I'm just talking about living the life that we all ought to be able to lead, whoever we are. And the group in Woodhouse Park have set up a wellbeing trail. And they are just about to do some research and start working with people, park staff and community members around Woodhouse Park in parks, looking at 2 of their parks and how they can redevelop them. And yeah, it's the most southern bit of Wythenshawe, the nearest bit to the airport. Yeah. But that's one of the other things, nobody knows this area, it's called Woodhouse Park, but it is. Anyway, I'll hand you back.
You can't rush a slow baked biscuit really when it comes to
No.
something, but you kind of want to be there like yesterday.
Yeah. So most of the work I do, I'm definitely spending so far like 2, 3, 4, 5 years supporting people. It's that kind of work where I'm supporting people in terms of developing their skills, and I would include the skills for people to work together, people who are coming from different backgrounds and you may not always get on so well, kind of those kind of skills I think really, really needed, to help people become ready, like you were saying. Absolutely. Like it's like, how do you get ready so that you are able to go, whoa, we want that lease and we're taking on that building. And I think mostly the work I've done in the last 3 or 4 years it's been that making people ready work.
I'm going to do a little twirl and pop Gurj over here, because I think hopefully we'll be, just going to bring Alice back in the room. Like you say, very bad angle. Hiya Gurj, over to you for a little overview from your bank. Obviously we've got a very big panel today, but
we thought we'd be greedy because there's so many interesting tales around this stuff to tell, that actually different perspectives are all part of what we're trying to get out today. So tell us a bit about your interest or how you've worked in this sort of building side of things. We know that your sort of specialist areas are in sort of finance. You can tell us a bit about that, but I know that you've also been involved in universities and the diocese and chess and all that. So fire away.
Absolutely. Firstly, I hope you can all hear me because I know I'm on the laptop, and I apologise I can't be there. I'm in the confines of a hotel room in Glasgow, so I'm not anywhere glamorous by any means. And I know some of you around the room because I've worked with a couple of you as well already. But my background is essentially, I'm a qualified management accountant. I've done that for 20 years now. So essentially, I've worked for a wide range of different organisations. I was very much on the dark side for a good portion of that. I worked for corporates and commercial entities and shareholders for a good portion. But then I've also worked, as Kayla's mentioned, for organisations such as the Royal Exchange and the arts sector. I am also a trustee on the arts, Thick Skin Theatre as well. That's an arts sector group in the Northwest. So I'm very used to the funding sector, what funding dependencies, and also income generation. That's a key thing that I work on. And also worked with faith groups. So I worked for the Diocese of Manchester Church of England. I currently work for and support government. So I work for the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, and that's GDPR and data protection, essentially. So I've got a good breadth of knowledge, but my key point here has been wanting to support, because I heavily believe in the value-based and ethically based and ethically led concept of social enterprise. That's something very close to me from my family's heritage, because I come from a very agricultural farming region of India as a second-generation immigrant, and that's quite close to me about self-subsistence. The idea of community, the idea about provision, the idea of working together was something that's very close to me in terms of how I guess my forebears came to this country and also survived and grew. So the concept of cooperatives and the concept of working together was the only way that actually people were able to survive and build and grow. So it's something very, very close to me, and I believe in it heavily. I also see and hear a lot of fantastic options and fantastic ideas and genuine passion when I speak to people. And with my finance background, I tend to be the person who supports, because everything that's been spoken about is really, really key. Tom was talking about the asset piece. It's really important to understand that. It's important to understand where you are from a negotiation point. I think Sarah was just talking about the idea about regeneration, gentrification, the differences. Absolutely, you need to know exactly what your purpose is. And from my side, it's a case of saying that finance is really at the core, because I've seen a lot of people come through with fantastic passion, a brilliant idea, something that's genuinely needed as well. As with the Old Abbey Taphouse and what Rachel was talking through, it was genuinely needed. There's genuine requirement for it, but the financial piece can actually be the blocker. And often people have this brilliant idea, but they're very, very scared about it. So what I tend to do, and what I've done in previous sessions and work that I've done with Flourish and other agencies and other individuals, is really try to break down the fear of finance. There shouldn't be a fear of finance. And the idea is that everything that you're doing financially, you should support you, but you should be embracing it. It should really be something that you're close to and you're not afraid of at all, simply because it's the greatest signpost to your survival. It's the greatest signpost to your ambition, and it's the greatest signpost to where you want to be. It doesn't necessarily classify your identity, but it definitely classifies your circumstances, and your circumstances then classify your options. So we were talking about being able to be ready and prepared and aware for things, and actually being financially astute and understanding where you sit is really key to that, because without that, you're not really going to be able to be able to manage the opportunities. So if an asset came up, would you be able to apply for that? Would you have the funds or the money or the backing or the sponsorship or the group to be able to approach people and actually make that change within the asset that you might have at the moment? Are you able to reach all the people and all aspects of the community and support that you want to do? Do you find that there's areas and issues that are lacking or missing? That's a continual challenge. You'll never get to a point where you're ever happy. Believe me, it doesn't matter whether you're a charity or a PLC or a huge conglomerate, you're never happy with where you're actually at. People are always chasing and moving. The idea is keeping an eye on your finances allows you to appreciate what your options are in that given moment, and also starts to forecast really strongly for the future. So I have a long history and a good support of just really breaking down and also detailing the budget and the forecast process as something that's intrinsic to what you do, because it sets out the guidelines of where you are, how far you can go and what you can have. You got to think about it as you really got to think about it as like almost like the teenager who wants to run away from home, and then they get to the end of the street and they realize they haven't really got enough money for the train ticket to get to London. So they're like, yeah, I better go back home now because I haven't really thought this out properly. So essentially, they might have this grand vision and this idea for freedom and liberation, but they still feel constrained by things. So it's really about trying to forecast out and understand where you are. And often I fully appreciate this because I feel really bad about it. I often get into the position where I come across as a bad guy because I'm always like, sorry, we can't do this right now, or we can't do this in the first year, or maybe in the first 2 years. And that is never an issue. What that does is, I'm trying to say from a finance point of view, it's not an obstruction. It's not something that's, I know often can be probably a negative experience for many. I'm really trying to take that away. And I really mark it out as being signposting. The budget, finances, and everything that finances represent are really about being your best friend. They're the most honest and true support you'll ever have to be able to understand what you can do, when, and how quickly. The other thing that I do in support, especially for people who are coming in new, looking at funding, looking at support, looking at making sure they have full coverage, is doing the work on bids, so financial support for bids, which we've done before, but also looking at the bid process and understanding your full financial scope, because when a lot of people do set up, they're reliant upon friends, family, volunteer elements. So it's really important to get the objective view and support to say, right, where do you actually stand? How much is this actually going to cost? And scoping things out. The reason being that isn't to say that that's not your reality, but when you're going for funding, you want to have as complete a picture as possible, so that when you're going into funders, you're going in with a confident picture of where you actually are and what you want to do. And given the challenges that everybody's aware of and being picked up in the previous presentations this morning, obviously building in contingency for inflation, building in contingency for energy costs and rises within specific raw materials or particular input goods that you may have is a really important factor. So being able to not just leave things static, but continually work with them is a key thing. Finance isn't a relationship that, it's not something that, it's not like the dentist, it's not like something that you hate and you go up for a checkup once every 2 years. It's unfortunately somebody that you have to check in with like on a daily or a weekly basis to make sure that you are on top of things. So as a consequence, it's about breaking down those barriers, because once you've broken those barriers, you'll actually have the full understanding of what you can do. And that's the best way to maximize the fantastic potential and the passion and the idea that you have, because that's the way that it can travel the furthest. So in theory, yeah.
Thanks, Gurj. I'm going to just pause you there because I know we've got a dedicated roundtable session with you this afternoon. Yeah. So
we thought women could talk.
I don't know if you heard that. Nicole was saying we thought women could talk. But yeah,
there should be no gender bias, really, should there? So
exactly. But yeah, we've got some time with you this afternoon, so there's an opportunity to pick Gurj's brains and go into the specifics of the finance. Sure. Would be fantastic. What I'm going to do now is we've got such a large panel. I've got some questions I want to ask, but instead of going to everyone on the panel, if I could ask you to put your hand up or indicate if it's something you'd particularly like to answer on, rather than going to every single person, as we've got a lot to get through.
I take a couple of pictures. I've taken a couple already. I want to share it less. I don't want to share. Is anybody who'd rather not be the photo or hidden out of the way? Just put our pictures on Twitter or our website. But other than that,
Brilliant. Thank you. Picture consent done. So yeah, we've heard a little bit about some of the kinds of individuals or organisations who are interested in this. I'd like to move on to the methods and approaches that people are using to start to get these things going, how people are going about it, and if you've got any live case studies, examples of people who have done it and how they've done it, it'd be great to hear that. So, Tom,
yeah, absolutely.
I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. I think one of the strongest community asset transfers I've seen over the past, particularly over the past decade, has been one that is at Clapbridge Community Zone and was initially taken by Clapbridge Community Zone, and that's in Wigan, and that was initially done by an organisation called Abram Ward Community Co-operative that are now Wigan and Lee Community Charity. And it's headed up by a fantastic social entrepreneur, a guy called Dave Baxter. So I was involved at the beginning to help broker the actual deal with the council. So the typical things that you would normally go through, in addition to what I talked about earlier with business planning and governance structuring, you have to have obviously a condition survey on the asset. That you have to understand whether there's any areas of dilapidation, what's going to be coming up, not just over the course of the next 12 months, but the next 3 years. Sorry.
Yeah, I was able to sort of find a building, but for those people who haven't got a clue where to look for a building or what type of building, you know, that are allowed, where do they look for those buildings? So
initially it has to begin with the local authority, because they, although there might be a lack of availability for particular assets, they are the immediate initial organisation that you would go to as that accountable body. So as an example, you would speak with somebody within an estates or a properties directorate, and they will be able to signpost you towards what is available and what's not. Outside of that, there are housing associations that do offer specific assets as well, and they're always really useful to engage with. Not very well, and that is that's always been a concern around community asset transfer, that assets are not very well publicly publicised, to be perfectly honest. So some local authorities are very good at it in terms of they will publish assets and they will go through rounds of community asset transfers. That's quite uncommon these days now because of the significant demand.
Whose responsibility at the council is it to advertise community asset transfer?
So
is it estates?
It would be estates or a property department. Yeah, they don't have a mandatory requirement to advertise unless there is a tender or procurement process for a particular asset.
Certain contacts, I'm just going to say, and I don't know if you can accept this now, or not, but GMCDO ran a really good workshop last week all about certain things to do with community hubs and buildings, and it was a really good discussion. I think it's been put out as a webinar, and we'll share the link with that if we're allowed to, because some of the direct contacts to certain departments we talked about there. So.
Yeah.
So I was involved with a co-op and I found some land, and I also was trying to get 2 properties in Gorton. So the first thing I did is go to the local councillors, write a really good document, summarize your group, your aims, read the council's housing strategy or land strategy or asset thing, and just use all the big words. So I think last year it was hyper-local, write a really good email. And then I got to go and present to the Gorton councillors, and then they put me in touch with the estates team. There's also one councillor who's basically in charge of housing and assets. So if you can try and get a link into her, but there is no, I would promise you, there's nothing left in Manchester to asset transfer. In Manchester, I've stopped putting stuff.
Yeah, but the one of the key aspects to it is obviously having a voluntary sector representative that's able to be that advocate for you. So whether that is a local CVS or whether there is social enterprise that's out there that's delivering. And as mentioned, obviously, people like myself have been constantly involved in that brokering between local authorities, which helped in the case of Clapbridge Community Zone in Wigan. It was successful because of, first and foremost, the different types of revenue streams that they were able to implement from the offset. So they had, through social enterprises they work with, they had a group of organisations that were immediate tenants. So there was an immediate revenue stream from tenants coming through the building. They thought very carefully about the type of community cafe that they wanted, because they wanted to look at having a combination of cafe that could serve a purpose for local residents that were a part of the Abram ward, but could also service tenants when they were hosting conferences, events, etc. So it was twofold in terms of that revenue stream from a catering, food and beverage perspective. So those two revenue streams were key. Then it was backed up by some elements of grant funding. So they've been successful recently with Power to Change and delivered a really successful project, and that's involved providing seed type funding to local social enterprises that are making a tremendous community difference, and then other small pots of grant funding on top of that. So what has been critical is that multitude of different revenue streams. And Gurj touched upon it before, because obviously finance is key to all of this. And having that ability to have those different revenue streams is so important when it comes to delivering a successful community asset transfer.
Thanks, Tom. Anyone else? Petra?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Stretford Public Hall, and it's obviously there's not that many buildings that are sort of late 1800s and grade 2 listed, and it's huge. It's got a ballroom of up to 400 people and lots of other spaces. But just in terms of the story of that building, literally when the council put it up for sale, it was 2 local women in the community. They were just mums, happened to see it, and it was kind of them getting together and saying this building can't be lost. So it was really just an opportunity, and it could have easily been missed. So I think that is one of the challenges, is that often you don't know that these buildings are going to be sold and lost to the community. They didn't really have much experience of working with local authorities or setting up a social enterprise or business, but they were just really lucky that they were able to get support from bodies like Co-operatives UK and Locality. I don't know if people have heard of them. They're also a national infrastructure body, and they got the right advice. But what they did do, they knocked on doors and they did coffee mornings, and they had, you know, people making donations, and they got the community involved early on. And that's really key, I think, when you're trying to take over at that early stage an asset or community building or space, is, you know, knock on the doors, get the community engaged right from the start, and kind of demonstrate the need for the building and why it's important, and get the business advice. And there is fortunately lots of business advice and funding around there to help you with that side of things. But it really was just, you know, an opportunity, and often, you know, what we are seeing, particularly, probably not as relevant here in Manchester, but in rural communities, we're seeing lots of rural communities coming together where they're losing their last shop or pub, and they're coming together and setting up co-ops to run these facilities. But there's a lot of volunteer effort goes into that, and it's a big commitment, but it works. Yeah, so it's, you know, there's different pathways that people come to this, and sometimes it is pure chance, as it was for Stretford Public Hall. We could have lost this beautiful building quite easily, and it's just by chance that we had local people who were willing to step up and do something about it.
Thanks, Petra. Any other routes or examples of ways in to getting this stuff started?
Are you talking purely on asset transfer?
No, it can be much more. Yeah, obviously there's asset transfer, which is, it's clear that there's a shortage of assets, but
So wandering around, there's loads of underused spaces. So you might find like a pub or a cafe that's not being used a lot. And if you go and talk to the owners, and if they own the building, they might not want to run it anymore. They might be looking to hand it over to someone. So in the past, I just went around, you know, these kind of venues you see around and you're never sure what they do. I'd go and just pop in and try and chat to the owner and have a drink, and then see about the space, because lots of spaces are underused in the daytime. Like pubs are dead during the daytime. There's space to do activities there. So I feel like there is other ways, especially in the current economic climate. I keep seeing people have their signs up with business for sales. And if you have an empty business, you have to pay business rates on it. So it's actually in people's like benefit to put in a social enterprise. So there is other ways.
Actually, I didn't say, but in Preston, that's what we've done with there was an and the owner used to be a bookmaker's, Keys. It's opposite the Harris Museum, which is now closed. And the Harris Museum is a beautiful, it's a museum, it's a library, it's a cafe, it was a free place for people to go to, absolutely beautiful inside. And they've closed it down for 3 years. to improve it. But so we've been in talks with the council, and the community is like a climate emergency officer who's been in communication with the local makers, and they've negotiated on behalf of Preston Climate Emergency Centre a short-term lease, but it's until October. And there's lots of things that you can't do, but like you were saying before, like the rent is, technical rent, it's like, I think it's about £100 for 2 months, and it's a rolling contract. But then we keep on seeing people in front of the building looking, you know, that they're interested in buying it, because it's a great asset opposite the flag markets in the centre. This beautiful view of the Harris Museum right in front of us. So, but what I would like to know is, like, I see the need of a community run building. I see it like to make it bigger, like a community supermarket selling low cost food, and like a bike repair cafe, you know, a cafe as well. But what I find is that there are loads of people that say, yes, we need it, and look at all these empty buildings, because people come in front of the shop and we always talk to people on the street. But then it's, I think, the problem of running it, because there's only a few very dedicated people that have the skills, very few, and the time, and also those people are very stretched, and also they're working for free. So it's a question of, and where I am in Preston, we don't have a place like Flourish where, yeah, but on the other hand, I see the benefits, because we're very connected to many different community groups that can provide support. But yeah, so I'm just kind of, you know,
Do you see what I mean about the industry around it? It's like, you got to do something community.
Why you consultants in this, but to actually do the community work, there's not many people with the skill sets, and those people should be paid for their time to do it.
Agreed. And there are funds, limited funds, but there are funds out there. So, as an example, later this year, the Department of Levelling Up Housing Communities will reissue what is known as the Community Ownership Fund, and that's a fund that is up to £250,000 per applicant. Starts with a two-phased approach. So you have an expression of interest that goes in, and then there is a sifting panel, and then you get invited back to complete a full stage application if the panel feel that your application is good enough to do that. So that type of funding, although it being limited in the sense that there's not many like it around, they will fund both capital and revenue costs. So it will fund staffing costs for people that believe in the community, that obviously can't just be volunteers, because we all recognise that ultimately, you know, everybody puts thousands and thousands of hours into trying to do things for your local community, and I do exactly the same at my local sports club, and it could be a full-time job in itself. So I think with these types of funds, it's knowing that they're out there, because again, the age-old problem of them not being very well publicised whatsoever, and therefore I think if you can access those types of funds with the backing of the local authority. So as an example, I'm not sure with Preston City Council, for example, but if they had a department that looked after the voluntary sector or community development, then they could potentially support a bit like that. Basically provide people. I know, for example, within my local council at Wigan, they have a small team of people that are constantly issuing out funding bulletins and provide expertise around writing successful funding bids. So I would imagine, albeit maybe a small resource, there are local authorities out there that are providing that support to enable you to access that type of grant finance.
Has Preston got a CVS? No, we don't have a CVS. Yes, we don't know how much CAP.
It's just whether it's in-house.
I know you're making a really good point.
Yeah.
Everyone else
Yeah,
has
yeah.
done.
Yeah, I think there are funding and support around that, but I mean, like Community Ownership Fund, I think you will have to go on quite a long way down the line and have quite a good proposal to stand a chance, and it's very competitive. And I think there is that gap at the really early stage. You know, where do you get that support? And yeah, I would acknowledge there is a gap. I mean, even with the program that I manage, the Hive, we support new start cooperatives that are looking at taking on assets, but essentially setting up any kind of cooperative business or social enterprise, if you want to call it that. But again, we kind of expect, you know, that early stage of homework to have been done. Have you consulted with the community? Do you have a reasonable idea of whether this might be successful in terms of finances and everything else? So I think there is a bit of a gap in that early stage. But we do work with lots of local authorities and we partner with them. And there is a cooperative support agency in Preston and in lots of these places, but it's obviously finding them.
I'm sure from conversations we've had before, I don't think you have to be a co-op necessarily to start to have some support from the Hive, or you might put talks on that people could come to and they thought about a legal.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends what you call a cooperative, and in that looser sense, that kind of community ownership, that idea that it's for the community is quite wide. The other thing that we have with cooperatives is that we have this unique form of funding called community shares, and it's really the idea that people put their money in their pocket, a bit like crowdfunding, and invest. And it's surprising how many people, there's something like 130,000 people across the country have invested in things that they care about. And you know, you lots of people would do a crowdfunder, but the idea of investing is that then you become an owner and you have some rights and you get to vote and you have some say in those decisions. So that's quite powerful, rather than just giving a donation to a charity. So we've, you know, 500 communities have now raised £200 million from their local investors for all of these co-ops. And I think it's just that kind of culture, that idea of, rather than it being done to you, you take control of your community and the things that are important to you. And that might be one asset, or it might be a whole area in terms of regeneration and housing and everything else. And we're seeing increasingly lots of communities looking at that and saying, I'm not waiting for government or whoever, I'm taking control and making this happen now because it's important to me and my community. Sorry, that was a bit of an impassioned plea there, wasn't it? Sorry. Yeah.
Although we've got people here not from Manchester, a lot of people are, and it'd be worth just hearing a little bit about what they're up to at the moment. And then I'd love to hear a little bit more from the private version of so we might come to one here.
Yeah, so we've done. Oh, should I?
There you are.
Well, yeah, so we at GMCBO, we've been offering social investment around Greater Manchester for quite a couple of years now. I've been there for around 2 years so far.
I know the Old Abbey had a chunk of that because we helped them out a bid to get it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
loads of people have actually applied. Our first fund was Access to Growth. It was actually quite successful. Loads of funding needed around Manchester. Obviously, it's something everyone knows. But the second fund we recently launched is called Proper Good, and it's more place-based. So it's obviously, I think a lot of people already know about it. It's based in Wigan, Bolton, Oldham, and Stockport. And the idea, obviously, is just to offer a lot of accessible finance to places where we think could really use the social investment, right? So one of the good things is there is like an early stage fund, which super subscribed to. People are really interested in sort of testing out their ideas. There's not been a lot of funding available for people to test out their initial idea, and it sort of feels like a really big step that people have to take sometimes. Massive commitment. People in the private industry are so open to taking loans to try out ideas. People don't even think about it twice, but in social investment, even when people really need it, it's seen as like a financial burden a lot of the time. So a lot of the work we're doing is trying to break that stigma around investment is good. Investment, if you take it at the right point for your organization, it could be super, super helpful. But again, that's something else that we're sort of working on, is making sure organizations get the money when they need it. So all our funds are sort of based well, there's a lot of thought that went into the way that we set up each fund. So for example, the early stage fund is an interest-free loan. So that's just to sort of, yeah, I think that makes it a bit easier for organizations to take on.
What's that up to?
So that's up to 30,000, which I think is pretty good for an early stage to try out an idea. And then it's 1 to 3 years. We don't have any like repayment or like no early repayment fees or any of that sort of thing. And then we have a scale up, which is for organizations. This is up to 100,000. So for organizations that are a bit more established, we offer a bit more funding, and then that's just to sort of help you grow. That was also built in a way where your repayments slowly grow with your organization. And then finally, there's a property fund, which I'm currently managing. That's up to 350,000. So one of the biggest things we realized was, although people want to buy assets, if you even find an asset that you want to buy, a lot of the time the banks will give you a mortgage. A lot of the time you might not even have all the money, just the cash on hand to do it as quickly as you need to do. So that's what this fund offers. So it can be used for anything you want to do with a building, including refurbishing, refinancing, that sort of thing. But the whole idea has just been that we're trying to make purchasing an asset as a social entrepreneur a lot easier. Again, this is, sorry.
No, go for it.
Yeah, this is again something that we're working with the banks and talking to them and trying to figure out. Every time we do get someone in, we have a conversation with one of the banks to try and be like, is a mortgage an option? Is this something that you would consider, given how high risk they usually see social entrepreneurs? They don't take into account that, like you said, you do everything. So
the value return is still a mystery to them. Most of them, actually.
Yeah. A lot of the time people can't actually put into words like the return they'll get per pound on the social economy. That's something that we're trying to still work out how to really figure out. A lot of the time people can't even explain their social impact.
Come to one of our workshops, you'll soon get it. But
there you go.
What I was going to say was this is something that we're looking at. I've always been anti-loans and all of this stuff, because a lot of people we support are very early stage, and helping women who are already, you know, a bit nervy about certain things. I'm not saying all women, but the women we work with, they're not in a position to take on a loan. That said, we've been working with a number of them for like 5-10 years now, and some of them actually are. We're now looking at this, and it's sod's law that we actually need to take on the loan in Tameside, but Tameside falls out of the loop of this, and you know, all that malarkey. So if there's one thing that we can try and do in Manchester, and we'll have to think about ways about this, is, you know, how we encourage, shame or cajole some of those other boroughs to somehow get involved in this, and making them see how those boroughs are at a disadvantage. And hopefully JMCVO, we will gladly support JMCVO to kind of figure out how we make that jigsaw across Greater Manchester be more equal with this sort of great opportunity. Might be a dream, but we'll see.
I mean, we've already worked on securing funding, hopefully in January, which will be Greater Manchester wide, because we did realize we're still getting so many inquiries for other sort of boroughs. And there's just like loads of different things that you can do with social investment. Like I've heard some ideas here that obviously you always hear new ideas, I feel like, in the sector, but there's things like friends of groups that have taken investment, which you wouldn't usually think of, but they took it on and it helped them. I think it was Friends of Victoria Park. They built like a really cute little cafe and stuff, so it was really nice. Loads of different organizations that do more like active stuff. There's loads of community grocers that we have as well.
Different housing options as well.
Yeah.
And Rachel from community-led housing, Greater Manchester Housing, would hope to be here. She's taken her daughter off to uni this week, but that they're a great resource if you're looking at assets and housing. Just I know time, I'll pass you back to Shelley. We focused a bit on the asset side of the asset transfer side. I just wonder, with the question that Shelley was asking before about examples, it'd be lovely to just hear from Juanita a little bit more. Obviously, you're in the position where you've got this building. You know, if I've got a couple of questions. You know, as somebody who's got a building that they can do something with, you know, I guess, how has it been for you? How can we encourage more Juanitas in the world? Where do we find?
Yoga. It was yoga. That is ultimately like yoga. As you are unsticking fascial adhesions within the body, you are unsticking limited beliefs within the mind. I think in Sanskrit, if we were to go deeper, and when science finally does catch up, it'll be something to do with the samskaras, these impressions that are, you know, like when you hear something that isn't pleasant or something bad happens in front of you, and it creates like a little, even if it's only small, like harsh words, there'll be those constrictions, those contractions are the life experience. And I think that when we start to unpick that, so much fell away about my mindset. Like the entire way that I was going about life, like treating it like a Monopoly game for a start, was inaccurate, but it was based on our society and everything that you've been taught from the get-go, that it's competition over cooperation, that it's survival of the fittest, this kind of mentality that we're raised with, and it's inaccurate. Like Gurj was pointing out before, that cooperation is actually a survival instinct that we wouldn't be here without. So it kind of huge shift in mindset, which left me a bit nowhere really, because it's sort of like, gosh, everything I ever thought I was, I'm not. Everything I ever thought was, isn't. I've got this building, I'm in kitchens, but that's very superficial. What do I do? It took time. It took time. I had to jump off the cliff with absolutely no regard for what was on the other side of it, and then spend 2.5 to 3 years deep healing myself. And then I had enough clarity to start to put things in motion. Had I not had the life that I'd had previously and been a complete workaholic and a hothead and a go-getter, I wouldn't have been able to afford to take that time for myself. So did old life facilitate new life, and am I grateful for it? And was it for a reason? Yes, absolutely. It's also the reason why I was able to say, okay, I'm willing to not see anything back on the building for however long it takes. And I'm going to try and talk my bank into agreeing with me on that. And I can support myself for as long as it takes. Now, that came about as close to the wall as I would have wanted it to be honest. If we hadn't have got the crowdfunder, and well, yeah, COVID as well. But yeah, if we hadn't have had the crowdfunder this year, I'd be very concerned about getting through this winter. We have no core funding. We have no salaries funding. We never have had. We only ever have project funding. So when I'm here and I teach a class, I'm paid for that 1 hour of the class. The rest of the work that I do 7 days a week and have done since 2020 is completely free of charge. And the same with Ralph. He's paid for his hours of delivery in the Digi Hub, but we're still yet to secure that infrastructure, that core funding that's going to be so necessary.
Build your business model in other ways
and build it in other ways. Yeah, I mean, there are, I can't wait to meet with Gurj, but yeah, there's obviously other revenue streams. Obviously, now that we are open, that was the other thing, was getting open then puts you in a position where you are able to perhaps have other streams of income. So again, it was just, we've just got to get open. We've just got to get, again, there's things if I'd have known, like you said.
Just on a practical point, how did you manage you private learning an asset and having social trust? Did you put it, because me and Greg had put a bit of our personal equipment into our social enterprise.
Right.
Now,
yeah.
You know, I'm never going to say it, but I can imagine if it was your.
Well, yeah. Well, I know I still own the building. Yeah, I still own the building. I just haven't charged the residence centre anything for it yet. I'm going to have to at some point. The bank are not going to swallow this forever, but I think I actually did. I think the person that I had the chat with at the bank, I think I'd had previously experienced some mental health issues, because he kind of got quite emotional and said, "Good for you. Good luck with it." Which is a very unusual response from a bank, you know, that's kind of, so it's, it was unusual, you know, that was kind of,
people to find somebody.
It was just a bit, yeah, it was unusual. There's a lot of circumstances that when people say like, oh, what's the formula? It's like, if certain things hadn't walked in at certain times, a lot of synchronicity, I will say that. So, the only thing I put that's obviously getting into the floopy rather than the, you know, the sort of the more tangible, but there has been a lot of things. I mean, like to the point where it gets weird, to the point where you're like, surely I have to stop questioning this now. And it does come back to the fact that it's like, did go all in, and it was with the right intention. And if it hadn't have worked, I don't know, actually, it would have been catastrophic. But there was almost a knowing of, it can't fail, it cannot fail, there's too much at stake. And I don't know, that's what kind of spurs you forwards then. Definitely, yeah, it feels that way. It feels like the idea was sound. It wasn't something that I just thought, oh, this is a good idea and people have got funding for this, and then came up with something. I sat in this idea for 5 years, like down to where every little plant and piece of grass was going. Like I knew this building in my head before I even started. So that allowed a confidence that when you show up to like meetings and the people ask you questions about your idea, there was nothing I didn't know, because I really did fully know it in my head. So I think that that's kind of preparation, right intention, And I think things start to line up in the right way rather than obstacles appearing out of nowhere almost. I don't know, really.
That's really helpful. I know.
Tricky one.
So I'm sticking on.
There were a couple of other people's questions. I wonder if
Oh,
we can add
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just pass to Sarah and then.
So I was just going to say, sort of following up on what Juanita was saying, for those of you who are like thinking, how do we find the buildings, how do we find the people? I think there will be other people like Juanita out there, other business people who are thinking, how can we do things differently? And they'll be looking for someone with a strong social purpose, because it is people who've been embedded in commercial business for years, they actually also need help. So there's a potential for like a mutually beneficial kind of partnership, perhaps. I mean, I don't know who those people are, but I think it's about talking to people. I think it's about constantly talking to people. So not only talking to the community members that live around the park or wherever your new business is, but also talking to other businesses, other organizations, and people will pop up, and it will be, so you say it's like synchronicity, but actually I think a lot of it is to do with your intentions and your business experience that probably meant that when an opportunity was there, you recognize an opportunity, so you're like,
I agree with that,
talk to
definitely.
them. You know,
If your mindset's on something and you're focused, then your receptors are sort of aware and open and that sort of thing. But I think there have just been a few where, where I've sort of thought, do you know what we really need next? And it's not even been put out there. I just said, particularly our work with council, that was just so synchronistic. I just happened to bring the right person at a fair where I was making overnight oats at the school, and within a few weeks we were commissioned to write a course.
But you were making overnight oats at the school.
Yes, you're right.
So like if you're just at home having your idea and you're not, and it can be the random doing something at a school, doing something in a park, doing something network, coming to your event. There is a need to kind of get out there and connect, even if it might seem like pointless, I'm having a bad day, this is really pointless, but you never know.
I think it is those random connections. I mean, it's like I promote cooperatives, and I never know who's going to be thinking of setting up a new social enterprise or co-op, and it's just by chance, but it is often that network.
You were certainly a bit worried this morning when we were at 5 to 10 and it was going to be
and so these opportunities are where you connect. And I think the other thing about, again, I'm going to talk about cooperatives, is it's a big risk putting it all on your own shoulders and trying to do it on yourself. And so I think that's the nice thing about having that group of people, like-minded people who do that together. So you're not on your own, and I think that's really bringing those different skills and passions together is really important. But yeah, I think I've seen certainly in the last couple of years, maybe on the back of the pandemic, more interested in social enterprises and cooperatives, because people want, they kind of realize there's more important things in life, and they want to do things differently and better, and we've seen huge interest in running the business differently. So there are lots of private businesses out there that want to convert and do things differently, or trying to sell their business, and they want to give it to the workers or the community. So there's certainly been a huge increase in interest in people doing things better and in a different way, from the kind of standard thing we would expect.
I do think we've got a good opportunity in October, because loads of people are about to give up their businesses and they won't know what to do with their premises. And if you can approach them with a social enterprise or an idea to use their spaces, I think they'll be willing to listen. Everyone, in 2 years during lockdown as a business owner, it's been horrendous. But then the effect of Brexit, Christmas, we lost all our trade. We've almoys had enough of the government. I went and spoke to the government business advisors. They don't understand how businesses or supply chains work. Why, honestly, sometimes we turned over £500 million last year, and the wage I got for what I delivered, if I went and worked in the private sector, do you know what I mean? But I will do it because I love it. But the other people, if you're in your 50s, you've got 3 kids, if you're a single mum, you can't physically do it anymore.
That reality is hard to get. I mean, our utility bill at Stretford Public Hall, it's a big building, it's very hard to meet. It's gone from 17,000 to 50,000. We can't increase our income threefold
overnight. So how are community businesses supposed to survive? I have no idea.
Inflation on my bill. If I get the pints at 12 or 13 pounds a pint, I don't know. Do you know what I mean?
But it's exactly that, like you say, there'll be lots of opportunities, not for the right reasons, but there are some spaces that, for example, have someone which is a cafe in the day and a restaurant in the evening. Most places are one or the other, and they're completely unused during the day. So there are opportunities to bring those things together and keep those businesses going.
And I've just found personally with the council, they're not interested in Manchester Council. They like the collaborators. They want the Chinese investors. And the best thing to do is do your own thing. Go and get like some awards, build up your profile, get in the press, and then they'll come begging to you. But if you go chasing them, like say with GMCBO, I think at the beginning we weren't that interested in us, but we built up 2 years of trading, we got awards, we did this, and then people were interested in you. Then you can go with like a platform, and it's so hard at the beginning when you know you've got this amazing idea, everyone's dismissing you, and it's just proving yourself. And then also it's nicer when you like. I always find it funny. I've always done projects with no money, so we opened the pub with a brand new to me, great. There was no stock, there was no kitchen equipment, the oven alone cost £1,000, but because I've done all this event work before, I had people who were happy to give me beer for free and we could put on parties and raise money that way. But when I've worked with people who have loads of money, they don't have common sense, and it's really easy to lose loads of money really quickly. Whereas my way of never having any money, we built the business up really well. And now it's weird having money and to start spending money. I'm like, oh my God, you just spent £1,000. Like, do you know what I mean? I'm like that. I was like nothing over 800 quid every second hand. And when you start getting funding, they want you to buy brand new stuff. So actually, you can do more with second hand, and there's suppliers and people with appearances. And suddenly when you get all this money, they want you to buy brand new shiny stuff, and it goes really quickly. So yeah, like don't be afraid not to have any money and do stuff.
We've very nicely answered a bit of my next question already, but it'd be interesting to hear if there are any other creative ways that people are either engaging with their communities or reaching out to businesses or finding, we've heard very, very clearly from, I think, pretty much everyone on the panel that you need your network to make this happen, and you need to build that, whether it's for skills, expertise, funding. So any other practical ways that people might engage with potential stakeholders or communities in the early stages or as they grow? Thanks, Rachel.
So the work I'm referring to is the history work at the pub. So like I did history at uni. I love social history. I love hearing everyone's stories. And the pub is the last building of the Greenhays estate, which got knocked down. So from the day I reopened the pub, I've had lots of elderly people come with their grandchildren and their children to try and find their houses. And I'm very grassroots. I just listen to people. So over the course of 3 years, I had all these families come down and tell me their stories, but they're all quite proud, and lots end up in Wivenshaw. And it really affected their mental health having this area destroyed. What happened there would be called ethnic cleansing in another country. And then can you imagine your house has been knocked down and then left empty for 30 years and then sold for £1 to the university and Bluntwood? I would be raging. And that's the energy that's there in Hume. And we're on the 5th wave of regeneration. And some of these residents have been there throughout it. And they've met so many community development officers. Everyone tells them the same thing. And actually the university just encroaches, the business just encroach. So there is quite a lot of anger with the residents. And they couldn't place me to begin with. I'm not at the uni. I'm kind of one foot in the uni, kind of there. And it took a while to build the trust. But one of the things I did was talking to my archaeologist friend. We listened to all these stories and we're like, how can we let these people find where they lived and tell their stories the way they want to? So we talked to Archaeology England. We printed out all the old maps and we just put it on Facebook. We didn't get any funding for this. It was just an organic thing that we did over the course of 3 years. And I had a queue around the door of elderly people trying to find their houses. And then we took them back and found their exact address and got them to tell their stories. And it really helped with people's dementia, their mental health. And I just managed to get funding for that. And at the same time, I got approached by a historian about the racist history of the pub. And when he'd approached other spaces, they'd been like, no, it wasn't us. We don't want to talk about it. I think it's amazing. So Len Johnson and Will Charles, his best friend, overturned the colour bar at my pub. And so we started making a moment of it. So we started with a drink for Len Johnson. The first one, there was 6 people. The next year we had like 25 people. His family came. I'm not about spectacle. I like everyone to be at the same level. So we just had an open mic and anyone could tell whatever story they wanted. And it just got bigger and bigger. And then the last event 2 years ago, one of the events in lockdown, rammed, social distance, all these young people had come down and they started doing raps and poetry. And then I was like, these young people need their own night. So I launched Breaking Bars, which is a grime night. And I have youth from Trafford, Ancoats, Moss Side, Longside. This has never happened in Manchester. And it's all about positivity and anti-racism. And I just managed to get us heritage funding for this. And I don't think heritage funding has ever funded a grime night, but there's actually politicalness to it too, because the grime music scene, two young people from Moss Side have been imprisoned because they were involved in music, and it's been linked to gang crime, to the stabbing. And it's just ridiculous that the type of music that you listen to can affect you going to prison. Any other coloured skinned person wouldn't have that issue. So there's also a lot of activism involved in just putting on an event and putting on this night and working with all these groups. But yeah, that's a really cool tool.
It's thinking about things left field, isn't it? And it's just giving something a go. And you know, whether you've got the creativity and energy of Rachel or not, that those people in old communities that, you know, Rachel is quite unique, but there's lots of Rachels, there's lots of Juanitas.
I agree completely with what you've just said, that if you wait for the funding, it'll never get going. It'll just never get going. Just do it anyway. Just go and do it anyway, without fear, without money, in whatever way, lesser way that seems at the time. And then someone will take an interest in the fact that you've already done it. I said to Ralph early on, when Sports England first funded those classes, because we'd been doing them anyway, just because it needed doing and it was the right thing to do. I said to Ralph, I said, it actually makes sense, doesn't it, really? I said, in an industry where if your idea is sound and what you're doing is sound, money is free. Bear in mind, I'm from the private sector. Like the work you had to put in to extrapolate a deposit out of one individual's hands was so difficult. And I said to Ralph, I said, I think actually that it's, to some degree, isn't it, the sector's way of protecting itself? Yeah. If somebody can just walk in, take a load of funding and then go bump, but if you've just put in 2 to 3 years worth of solid graft, you've had to give up other paid work in order to do it. It's proving an intention as you're going along. And I said to Ralph, I said, I think that's just what we're going to have to do. I said, I reckon I can survive for about 2 years. And actually we hit that mark around about when the crowdfunding ended. So yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't want to say it's how passionate are you, but to some degree, it does start that way, doesn't it? Because I think it's,
and being resilient,
yeah.
And then consistency in communities, because people pop in and out. People just have all these. I've been in Moscow for 10 years. So many people pop around to the community, just tell you about their idea, haven't listened to the community, haven't listened to the work community's done for 10 years, then get pissed off that no one wants to jump on their project. Do you know what I mean? And I just being authentic and being consistent.
And consistency, definitely, because I think project funding a lot of the time comes in waves of 5 weeks. 6 weeks. So just when a community's got used to something being available, it's gone again. So it never kind of really sort of takes hold. So that was why with the sober dancing that we do here on a Thursday, it had to be every week. And once everybody kind of realized Thursdays are for dancing and it was never going away, it was there every Thursday, that's when we started to grow the numbers. And I'm like, it's the consistency. Just got to keep,
I think it's way more, I can achieve more if 5 people once a week than doing a big massive project again. There's a big, you make more difference in people's lives, but then the numbers for the funders they don't like it, it's not backing up loads of
some funders are waking up to the death as opposed to numbers. It varies on funder to funder.
But there's a real issue with the funding forms. But like I serve everyone. Human Muslim is a very mixed community. You get students, you get lecturers, you get people who live there for years and years and years. And the funders constantly want me to break down their blocks. GMC after gave us a loan, you wanted me to do a questionnaire, not something. And I have to take the ethnicity and the sexuality of every person that comes through the pod. What am I meant to do? So I cheated, I got my booking form and I let the promoters do it. But can you imagine being a person coming to a pub and someone's like, are you a lesbian? Are you this? Like, it's the worst thing for community engagement. It's the opposite of what I want to do. I want to feel on the same level.
But that was actually a requirement from the bigger
funders.
No, that's what it is. It feeds all the way down, and that's why we recently launched the BASE network. I think it's not actually officially launched yet, but the whole idea of that was that we wanted to give BMA communities the full control over it. So they're hopefully getting their own funding that they can give out. A lot of it's like a type of co-op structure that it's very complex. And because the whole idea was we want to give the control back to the community. There's no point in us trying to conform with our funders' sort of regulations and then try and make that accessible to people, because it's just not going to happen, is it? The whole idea was that we need to give it back to the people, and they can figure it out themselves. Our communities can figure it out themselves. They don't need the classic middle-aged white man sitting on top telling them what to do or how to do it. If we just step out and like let people just do their own thing, that's the sort of best way to go about it.
I'm conscious of time, and I want to give the floor an opportunity to ask any questions that they've got burning. So we've covered all sorts, but I just wonder if we finish off by asking the panel, I'm going to roll 2 in 1 and cheat. So any particular examples they'd like to shine a light on of any people, organisations doing this well, or any pitfalls that people should be aware of before they go into this?
So it's really sad, coffee cranks are taking over Alexandra Park with a council tender. And then they've had a really hard time. They all kind of meetings about social enterprise to go and talk about how bad the council tender process is done. They were working for 10 years in Alexandra Park with the bike hub and Enviolution to get a cafe put in there. The council's paid really badly. Now Enviolution's leaving, the bike hub's leaving. That was 10 years of work they did for nothing. And now overnight, Coffee Cranks have shut down their cafe because council would only give them a 2-year lease. You can't do anything with a 2-year lease. You can't do tiny bits of community work. It's a disgrace how they've been treated. And I think there needs to be an investigation, because there's several occasions now I've been brought down to the council tenders and they're pitching community groups against each other, and that's the opposite of what should be happening. We shouldn't be fighting each other over assets. We should be working together.
Yeah, I'd just add to that. I mean, that essentially for Manchester, that's the role of any specific infrastructure organisation. So MAC, for example, one of the reasons why they are doing what they're doing is to help to broker that relationship, because ultimately, if there is a tendering process that leads to what's happened in this case, where obviously the asset now and the work that's gone into it has just been wasted over a 10-year period of time, then something needs to be done about it. And ultimately, that's going to come from an organisation like MAC that could provide that support and go back to the local authority and say, look, this isn't right, what's happening right now, and how can you contest that going forwards? Because when there's so much that's put into a particular community building or a community asset, it's not just obviously the building, it's obviously the people that have benefited over time that are now losing something that was part of them, which is hugely important. I see it. So I'm on the committee for my local sports club, and we're very lucky because the diocese gave us the building many years ago. So we're on a 99-year lease of some description for the land. We own our own building. We've got a car park. So we're in this fortunate position where we're able to obviously serve the purpose of the community. There's very limited danger that we'll actually be in a position where we'll lose the asset, but ultimately people depend upon us, to be there. Many of us do free coaching most nights of the week in various different sports, because there's obviously kids that are out there that can't afford, to pay for sport these days, which is a huge problem. So we do a lot of free voluntary coaching to ensure that they've got access to that. But that's because obviously we've been able to protect that particular asset. We've been able to have that right agreement in place with the likes of the diocese around the land in terms of usage. But that's something that we've worked on for years. Like, I've been involved in this now for, I would say, nearly 25 years in terms of helping, to grow, the accessibility into this particular sports club. So in terms of I think going back to the question around pitfalls, the pitfalls are down to, unfortunately, a lack of expertise that primarily sit within the public sector. And that is because we haven't got within our local authorities the resource that we once had in terms of the expertise that know how community asset transfers need to be managed properly. Because ultimately, even though a voluntary sector or social enterprise or CIC or cooperative are taking over the asset, there is still a management responsibility from the local authority, because they are the accountable body in most cases that still own the asset. So that management of that, although it comes down to 90% of the time the organisation that's taking it on, The other 10% is got to be down to the actual owner and landlord, if you like, of the asset to play a role in terms of managing that process properly. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist as much anymore. And therefore, we're reliant upon infrastructure organisations to navigate their way through, or ultimately, as it's been quite a clear theme this morning, of having to do it ourselves in terms of just going out there and getting it done. So I do feel at this moment in time, with what's happening with the cost of living crisis, there are pitfalls that lie within the expertise or lack of expertise at a public sector level, unfortunately.
Can I just say that our neighbourhood team in Kew doesn't live in Manchester. She lives in Liverpool and she works 9 to 5. So she drives all the residents crazy because no one ever sees her. She doesn't seem to know what's going on in the area. And I feel like that's not a lack of experience. That's choosing somebody who's not from Manchester. And it makes it so hard to.
But it's training as it's the culture of play of the council, isn't it? And it's just making me think, I'll just throw it out there, that so we know that across the voluntary community sector, it's the hotspot of how you access support. And because we've been involved for some time, with money that we've squished about from nowhere, we're creating a training supporter programme for the BCSE infrastructure in Manchester. And thankfully, I like not seen us as teaching to support. It's like a peer development type thing where we're not just going to do this, we're designing it together. And we've got consultants, infrastructure, and a real mixed bag, and that's happening soon. I'm really looking forward to seeing how that develops. And it feels like, as a sector, we might be able to. I'm definitely coming back to people who've been here today to talk about if we can help Tom and or others who've got links in those areas, below. If there's a trainer support, the trainer infrastructure program, we can professionally put there that we find the funding for. Nobody give us directly. Then there's ways around filling the problem. To me, and that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Sorry, anybody else on the panel?
Anyone else on that?
You were that question.
Yeah, that pitfalls or people who are doing it particularly well.
I think just on the particularly well, the example that I gave before around Flatbridge Community Zone being a really good example of where they have done it particularly well. They've been very much community rooted from the offset. They've understood what the community want. They're constantly consulting. They don't consult just for the sake of doing a grant bid, for example. They do it because they want to, and they want to ensure that the people that are a part of that local ward as such within Abram are served and have core service provision. So one aspect that's been particularly successful recently in connection with the cost of living crisis is connecting a Wigan Borough food network together and looking at food pantries and how they can support local people. That in itself has come about from consistent, coherent consultations with local people. That wouldn't have happened if it weren't for organisations like Wigan and Lee Community Charity, who've been out there consulting consistently. But that then has positive impact on being able to manage a community asset very well, being able to become sustainable to a fashion through what's been quite possibly one of the worst global economic disasters in terms of the pandemic that many have seen within our lifetimes. To be able to do that whilst managing a community asset, managing a relationship with the local authority, and still being able to deliver the core services that people need is a lot to be said for, really. So I think it's really that they've got a tremendous amount of self-resilience, but they've done that based on knowing what local people want through that consistent consultation.
Can I just add though that that organisation has received incredible amounts of funding to do some of those things within the Wigan Borough, and sometimes some of that, yes, yeah. There are. I don't feel like the community is fully represented at Wigan at that level, and I think we have a couple of people that represent Wigan at that level and get paid to represent Wigan at that level. So yeah, they've done amazing things, but I think there's also being that representative organisation, that's not a true representation of the BSE sector in Wigan.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think that I don't want to get too much into Wigan in isolation, but I'd agree, and I think that's changing now because there has been very much a persona that the organisation that was accountable for the Wigan Borough, for example, it was an organisation that are now no longer accountable for the community and voluntary sector. There's been recent change around building specific subject-based networks that enable people to understand what support's available for social enterprises for the voluntary sector. So I think from my side, it's been a long time coming, where the likes of Wigan and Lee Community Charity, they've been very lucky to receive significant funding from the likes of Power to Change. But I would also echo that they've probably been in a position to apply for that type of funding because of the work that they've done. I'm not saying that they are the be all and end all when it comes to the future of the sector.
And they're also very well, very close to the council as well, which puts them in that position.
Absolutely, and they've built that relationship in terms of being an organisation that have come from absolutely nowhere with very little funding, 10 years ago when they first tried to take on the community asset, and they've built that up over time, and therefore I think from that perspective as well, it's not as though they've known people within the council. They've had to really work hard at it in terms of getting to that place where they're now quite a key cog in the machine when it comes to the future delivery of what happens.
I was going to echo something different when I said echo that, in the respect that I was just going to jump to the community consultation bit that you're on about, because it's something we've touched on here, but I know we're at the minute time, aren't we, Shelley? So am I right to nod the laptop?
Absolutely.
And we've got conversations this afternoon, and some of the things we've been talking about here will no doubt get picked up and added to, and for those that you're saying we can continue conversations. I was just going to add to that bit about community consultation and how, whether you know what you're doing with it or whether you want to do it, it's a massive part of growing a community development, whether it's private, leased, or anything else. And we fortunately we've known that because we're specialists in doing that, but we've had to put that into practice ourselves through these assets that we're developing in Heaton Chapel and in Broadbottom. And so I was just going to say some of the things that people were saying, it's taken us, it's been a year now, we realise we've been doing the consultation bit for a year, and you think, well, how do you fit that in on top of your day job, and how do you do all this other stuff? But you just have to find the time to do it. And the ultimate goal is to create these assets to build legacy for Flourish longer term, and to create amenities and assets and housing and other things for communities where we these things start to grow. I was just going to mention to others here, we talked about you can do that with with 30 quid in a free room, if that, tea, biscuits, a bit of fruit, and you're in there. So you can start the process like some people have been saying with nothing at all.
I kept asking for help because all the way through, even before lockdown, there was so much food waste within the area. I don't want to say but there was just so much waste, and luckily someone bought me a fridge van, and on a Saturday I would literally go and collect a van load of food, a transit van, and I would be out 10 hours delivering food to all over, not just in Openshot. And I was desperate to get a building or somewhere, even if it was a market store, somewhere that would save me going round, travelling all over the place, petrol money, then I was on insurance and like that, to deliver food because people were going without food. And I was doing that for a good 18 months, and then it was Adrian that runs Manchester Settlement, the Roundhouse. He was like, I'll give you a room, I'll provide the fridges.
Things do just take time, don't they? And I know
the council was so bad. They was literally, and
first of all, my aim was to help working families, because everyone that I knew that was working were really struggling, to the point that I was being approached from our school club, teachers, helpers, that there was parents going to work in the pandemic, and the children at school still wasn't entitled to any kind of free lunch, and was going to school with a lunchbox with cold rice. You know, it was just heartbreaking. So that was my initial, you know, I need this.
Well, there's things that keep you motivated to keep going, and remind you why you're doing what you're doing.
This building to provide the food. Then obviously, you know, people will come out of work, then it's like, how can I not give them food when, you know, I can give. So people pay £5 and they get a week's worth of shopping. But if it wasn't,
but an opportunity like that you've created creates the hub then to talk to people, to gather information, and to the bit that people sometimes don't transition into, and that's why people like us and Sarah and Tom and others are around, is to help turn what you're learning and what you're hearing from the community into core data and information and chunks of stuff that you can go and then, you know, pitch for whatever you need with, and it takes time.
If it wasn't for the roundhouse,
yes,
you know, I just get hitting on that all the time.
Well, it's good to hear things are moving along now.
I think again, one of the powerful things about cooperatives is that everyone's been there and done it across the country, and you'll find another cooperative that will be willing to kind of share that experience and help you. So it's not always about money and expertise. It's about hearing from others who've been there and done it before. So that's kind of one of our key values and principles is that support and cooperation for the next co-op. But yeah, during the pandemic, Stretford Public Hall had to close. We couldn't be open for events, and we became a mutual aid centre, and we did the food deliveries, and we helped people set up digitally so that they could do their online orders and everything, and we've continued that through funding. But one of the co-ops I set up in Chiltern was Chiltern Bite Deliveries. During the pandemic, they just volunteered to do all these deliveries and food, and they're now a co-op, a social enterprise, and some of their money comes from actual paid deliveries, but they continue to do the volunteer ones. So it is about people's passion and time, and then finding a way to make that sustainable at some point. But initially it is all your sweat, time and passion. It's not, there is no easy answer to any of this, I'm afraid.
It was really bad because you're right, there was a huge gap of visions, and then I set the thing outside of the council one, and there's loads of amazing people like you who fill the gaps. And I want to do freedom of information about supermarkets, because supermarkets made a killing in lockdown. We were getting food donated from supermarkets. There was a guy called David Gale, who was a chef, who realised all these pigs were being slaughtered and going straight to landfill. And he took over Tameside Football Club and put in some fridges. But then as soon as the airlines and people found out, they were coming and dumping food at Friday at 9 o'clock, and they wouldn't give any money for my time, petrol, electricity to heat the food, the bins. And one of the food banks I was working in Salford, I spent most of the day throwing away the food, and it was all gimmicky. It's like chilli, sparkling water. Families don't want chilli, sparkling water. So I think we should, we've created this other industry, the supermarkets are profiting, us as social enterprise are paying electricity, bins to throw it away, and then volunteer time. And another issue with food banks is most people working in food banks are on low wage and need to access food banks. So we really need to address this industry rather than keeping it going out of goodwill that we did in lockdown. We need there's no more funding, there's no COVID thing. I'm seeing more increase, rise, need for it. And then I haven't got any funding, but we still do it. I can't stop doing it. But we need to maybe stop and have an assessment of who profited over COVID out of all our good work, and how we can bring some of that back into our...
What we need to start doing is accepting all these policies.
Yeah.
Desperate to volunteer, because then only volunteers
Yes,
and the thing is, the points that you're making in terms of community asset building also brings back to that you've really got to be careful when you
make these snowballs roll, because you can be lining the pockets of a bunch of other people, and it's just, you know, Gurj will know, and we'll chat no doubt about this afternoon, that, you know, looking at your sustainability model and all of these elements within it is going to be, you know, key to making things a success, or where you turn something into something that's actually viable, and all of the challenges that go with that. But I think I guess we've got to wrap up.
We have.
We get a bit of a lunch break.
Gurj was asking if he could talk on sustainable viable ventures, talk about the film group. Have we got time to talk about that now?
Do you want to just end on a
high? That's a positive example.
So yeah, tell us about your lockdown film club, Gurj, and
Did you film now?
Well,
absolutely, yeah. No, just a chance to say, I think people were talking about how to get started and some of the pressures about how to get onto the first step, really. And I just want to really reiterate from personal experience how that works. So I run community cinema in Headingley in Leeds, but part of that was also during lockdown, diversifying to say we couldn't actually show films in a physical space. We were limited to terms of numbers, turnover, etc. But we turned that onto an online group. And what that did is it, first of all, filled a gap for people who didn't have any other means of contact, or perhaps didn't have any other means of sharing a particular passion, and it brought them together. And we're still going 2 years later, where initially we started to meet on Zoom. We're now meeting not physically and still remotely as needed. But we actually have a really identifiable group of people where we've been able to scope out that they have a particular need, that it fulfills a particular purpose. That all helps when you want to try and work with, like we're looking to do, work with other additional partners within the Leeds area and other cinemas and independent venues to say, we want to screen something, we want to work with you, we want to do this. It gives us that credence because we know that we've got a group, we've got a purpose, we've got a reason. The whole concept of starting out with a mission and a brief is there, you know, it writes itself. So if you're worried about doing something, getting it started is just get it done. Sometimes people wait for funding, they wait for the money, but once you can generate that interest, once you can prove that there's a reason for it, and there's actually a reason to back and invest in it, then it really helps your step. It's very much like writing. People keep telling you they've got a fantastic novel in them, and you go, right, until you put pen to paper, we're not going to know about it. So it really is a case of actually just starting to do as well. Really just reiterate that from personal experience. I think that's a really positive step to take.
What Gurj is, that's great, Gurj, and what you were alluding to there, other people have said. I'll just kind of mention, we have other sessions, we've got some coming up along the way in these Flourishing Mondays around impact measurement and articulating the things that Gurj has described as review. So we've certainly got more sessions coming up where people have got those things, whether they're running them, they want to run them, and people that will know a bit on the programmes, creating the time to put the processes in place to give you the best chance to pitch your idea or to capture the learning from what you're doing alongside everything else. So, wow, a lot covered there, hey, Shelley.
Yeah, so I think we'll be wrapping up now. Just a quick note to people joining us remotely, there will be an opportunity to join the roundtable discussions this afternoon. So if you hop back on in about half an hour after lunch, then we'll put you in a group for the roundtable conversations. And then I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank our panel. So thank you, Gurj, Juanita, Petra, Tom, Rachel, and Sarah. That was really, really informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.